Just so we can understand the standard here, what is a fascist?
So a fascist is someone who's organizing a mass movement that's attacking women, immigrants, black people, other minority groups in a movement of genocide. That's what a fascist is.
Okay. So it's someone who's committing violence?
And it's someone who's committing violence and who's trying to organize other people to commit violence.
Okay.
And Milo Yiannopoulos is a fascist.
I resent the branding of these as anti-fascist protesters. They are nothing if not fascistic in their behavior.
They're fascists in their behavior, aren't they? There's nothing anti-fascist about that.
Although I'm not normally a fan of George Orwell, I have to give him some credit because he settled this argument way back in 1944. Quote, "The word fascism is almost entirely meaningless. In conversation, of course, it is used even more wildly than in print. I've heard it applied to farmers, shopkeepers, social credit, corporal punishment, fox hunting, bullfighting, the 1922 Committee, the 1941 Committee, Kipling, Gandhi, Chiang Kai-shek, homosexuality, Priestley's broadcasts, youth hostels, astrology, women, dogs, and I do not know what else. Except for the relatively small number of fascist sympathizers, almost any English person would accept bully as a synonym for fascist. That is about as near to a definition as this much-abused word has come. In other words, the term has been a corpse of common parlance since before most of us were even born. Everyone has enemies, and everyone loves to use the word fascist as a slur to express how strongly they oppose their enemies. This is encapsulated in the very origin of anti-fascism itself. Anti-fascism originated in the early 20th century as a left-wing propaganda term, used by communists and socialists to describe almost anyone who wasn't a communist or socialist. When the Allies won World War II and Germany was divided by the Berlin Wall, the Soviet-controlled East German government referred to the wall itself as the anti-fascist protection rampart, suggesting that the liberal democratic government of West Germany was as fascist as anything else. The charge of fascism has become even more diluted as time has gone on. In the present day, it seems like everyone and their dog is a fascist.
There is a dictionary definition, one word that describes that toxic blend. You're a fascist. Get them to print you a t-shirt with fascist on it.
The ideology this man represents is brown-shirted fascism. Hardcore, raw, rude, dangerous to your liberties.
There are aspects of the American government that are connected to the corporate state. As Mussolini famously said, corporatism is really a better name than fascism.
But let's not just take all these people at their word. Let's consult noted fascism expert Robert Paxton. In his 1988 essay, The 5 Stages of Fascism, Paxton describes 7 fascist feelings that he considers motivators for fascist movements. And to test his checklist, I'd like to take one historical example which predates fascism, and use this as a demonstration of exactly how elastic and poorly thought out Robert Paxton's checklist truly is. And that example is the 13 colonies and the American Revolution. So let's take a look, shall we? Point number 1. The primacy of the group. Supporting the group feels more important than maintaining either individual or universal rights. And point number 2. Believing that one's group is a victim. This justifies any behavior against the group's enemies. Did the American colonists believe that they as a group were victims of the British? Of course they did. Their reasons for rebelling against the crown were numerous, but it all boiled down to what the colonists viewed as an unjust imposition of British rule without representation or even counsel. They believed in this injustice with such conviction that they were willing to kill in order to resist it. Point number 1's mention of individual and universal rights provides us with a nice segue into point number 3, the belief that individualism and liberalism enable dangerous decadence and have a negative effect on the group. Now you might say that the Founding Fathers were all about individualism and liberalism, but the liberalism of the colonists was certainly not the social liberalism that someone like Robert Paxton would espouse in the present. The Founding Fathers did not, for instance, believe in universal voting rights for everyone, or other things that the modern conception of liberal individualism likes to project onto them, but we'll return to that in a moment. Point number 4, a strong sense of community or brotherhood. This brotherhood's unity and purity are forged by common conviction if possible, or by exclusionary violence if necessary. 13 colonies, subject to British rule and yearning for independence, united under the mantra of join or die in order to resist the British. And then when the British tried to come and force them to follow their rules, the colonists fought a bloody war for their sovereignty, resulting in a union which brought the 13 colonies under one flag. Point 4 is basically a summary of the American Revolution itself. And after the war, in his first presidential address to the newly formed United States of America, George Washington himself said, "To be prepared for war is one of the most effective means of preserving peace." And indeed, this is reflected in today's US military. Any liberal who views their ideology as a set of non-violent good guy values is simply lying to themselves. Point number 5. Individual self-esteem is tied up in the grandeur of the group. Paxton called this an enhanced sense of identity and belonging. The timeless slogan, "A pluribus unum," out of many one, embodies this sentiment perfectly, found everywhere in American iconography, right down to the currency, often accompanied by a particular symbol. The fasces, a bundle of sticks banded together into one stronger unit, is an ancient historical representation of the rule of law, of order, of unity, and of the nation, dating all the way back to the Etruscans almost 3,000 years ago. This symbol is also found all over American iconography, including memorials, sculptures, government buildings, and insignias. There's even a monument in Chicago called the Balbo Monument, which was a gift from Benito Mussolini himself. It still stands today. Point number 6. Extreme support of a natural leader who is always male. This results in one man taking on the role of national savior. George Washington was the central leadership figure of the American Revolution, to the point where he's still portrayed as the effective face of the War of Independence, an embodiment of the cause wrapped up in one man. He was so unanimously beloved by the revolutionaries that he easily became the first president and the namesake of the federal capital, and is still one of the most common figures portrayed in national symbolism. And to this day, all of his presidential successors have been male. And lastly, point 7. The beauty of violence and of will when they are devoted to the group's success in a Darwinian struggle. A Live Science article on Paxton's essay adds to this. The idea of a naturally superior group, or especially in Hitler's case, biological racism, fits into a fascist interpretation of Darwinism. Connecting back to point 5, the perspective of the American revolutionaries and founding fathers on the matter of groups and race was very different from the modern-day views held by the American public, and by neoliberal institutions as a whole. You probably already know that the founders were slave owners. But what's more relevant than this is the fact that even the founders who considered themselves abolitionists or questioned slavery generally believed in segregation of blacks and whites. In their personal writings, they expressed an explicit desire for this. For example, quoting Thomas Jefferson, "It will probably be asked, why not retain and incorporate the blacks into the state, and thus save the expense of supplying by importation of white settlers the vacancies they will leave? Deep-rooted prejudices entertained by the whites, 10,000 recollections by the blacks of the injuries they have sustained, new provocations, the real distinctions which nature has made, and many other circumstances will divide us into parties and produce convulsions, which will probably never end but in the extermination of one or the other race." James Madison wrote similarly, "To be consistent with existing and probably unalterable prejudices in the US, the freed blacks ought to be permanently removed beyond the region occupied by or allotted to a white population. The objections to a thorough incorporation of the two people are, with most of the whites, insuperable, and are admitted by all of them to be very powerful. If the blacks, strongly marked as they are by physical and lasting peculiarities, be retained amid the whites, under the degrading privation of equal rights, political or social, they must be always dissatisfied with their condition, as a change only from one to another species of oppression, always secretly confederated against. The character of the free blacks, even where their legal condition is least affected by their color, seems to put these truths beyond question. It is material also that the removal of the blacks be to a distance precluding the jealousies and hostilities to be apprehended from a neighboring people, stimulated by the contempt known to be entertained for their peculiar features, to say nothing of their vindictive recollections or the predatory propensities which their state of society might foster." Unquote. Although these men recognized the obvious injustice of slavery, they still didn't believe in what we now call integration or diversity. They clearly preferred that whites and blacks live separately in separate communities. Or to simplify even more, the founders of the United States were overtly racially conscious. Now, I'm not actually arguing that the American Revolution was a fascist movement. This exercise is purely in the interest of demonstrating how shallow and short-sighted Robert Paxton's definition of fascism is, and serves as a good illustration of how meaningless the typical usage of this term has become. It doesn't take a political science degree to figure this out. Paxton's attempt to define fascism purely in the pejorative sense, as Orwell described more than 70 years ago, has only enabled people who use it as an empty epithet.
What is this supposed to mean? What do you mean by that? Well, I mean, he's a fascist. The pirates...
Wait, why do you say he's a fascist? He's the president of the United States.
He's a fascist.
Do you realize how offensive that is?
I think he's a fascist.
Why?
Because he is.
In the process, he seems to have unintentionally laid out criteria which are applicable to almost any historical political movements who formed group identities and used violence against competing groups. Although it's true that actual fascist movements have historically used violence to achieve their goals, this in itself is obviously not exclusive to fascism. It's a property of feudalism, monarchism, liberalism, communism, and everything in between. Every political philosophy has and does employ violence or the implicit threat of violence to achieve its goals, and the founding fathers, despite being Enlightenment liberals, managed to tick all of Paxton's boxes. And not only do they fit, but they fit better than most present-day political positions, parties, groups, and movements. If we were to examine, say, Benito Mussolini and Giovanni Gentile's doctrine of fascism as a baseline for judging whether Antifa or any other contemporary political group could be described as fascist, it would quickly become apparent that fascism is essentially non-existent in the present political discourse. It's common for leftists to broadly describe something like the alt-right as fascism, but Mussolini himself expressed disdain for the idea of fascism as an inherently racial ideology, and this shows in the various interpretations of fascism by different peoples from around the world, from Latin America to Europe to East Asia and even the Middle East. For Mussolini, fascism was not purely about human biology, but rather the conception of a nation and its people as an organism in and of itself. So although racial consciousness or ethnic nationalism could be a component of fascism, it's no more inherent of a component than it would be in communism or liberalism or any other political system. Tribalism is just something people do regardless of political ideology, but that's a subject for another video. There are, of course, many other authors and historical figures one could consult for interpretations of fascist ideology, such as Oswald Mosley, Francis Parker Yockey, Cornelio Codreanu, Francisco Franco, Yukio Mishima, Oswald Spengler, Julius Evola, or A. James Gregor, just to shamelessly name-drop a few. Maybe even Hans Hermann Hoppe if you're looking for a more right-wing libertarian take. They all deserve an in-depth examination of their own, and you might be surprised by what they have to say. But all of them emphasize hierarchy, order, and the laws of nature as a basis for political and societal structure, things that Paxton and similar thinkers have overlooked in favor of irrational racism, spooky jackboots, and balcony speeches. The short, generic definition of fascist ideology is an attempt to synthesize elements of capitalism and communism as a revolutionary, unifying nationalist force, while making no ideological commitment to either. This is where the term third positionism comes from. A fascist views ideological capitalism or communism as two sides of the consumerist coin. You might say fascists were the true originators of horseshoe theory. But the point of this video is that those with a fetish for calling everyone fascist are missing the forest for the trees. After all, the stated goal of radical leftists like Antifa is to abolish the state and class hierarchy entirely and eliminate what they perceive as racism, sexism, and homophobia in order to seize collective worker ownership of the means of production. In other words, decidedly not fascist. Here's a quote from the Doctrine of Fascism. Thus, many of the practical expressions of fascism, such as party organization, system of education, and discipline, can only be understood when considered in relation to its general attitude toward life, a spiritual attitude. Fascism sees in the world not only those superficial material aspects in which man appears as an individual, standing by himself, self-centered and subject to natural law, which instinctively urges him toward a life of selfish, momentary pleasure. It sees not only the individual, but the nation and the country. Individuals and generations bound together by a moral law, with common traditions and a mission which, suppressing the instinct for life closed in a brief circle of pleasure, builds up a higher life, founded on duty, a life free from the limitations of time and space, in which the individual, by self-sacrifice, the renunciation of self-interest, by death itself, can achieve that purely spiritual existence in which his value as a man consists." Unquote. To me, that doesn't really sound like something an Antifa member would say. Antifa demonstrators routinely and nakedly inform us of their penchant for equality, revolutionary socialism, left anarchism, and outright communism, radical leftism of various stripes, and their stated goals and associated pet peeves mesh with these self-identifications. So don't be silly, just call them communists.